Hey, welcome back to the channel. How the devil are you? So, it's come to that time of year. The MOT is due up. It was due in April, but it got deferred because of the lockdown, which I was quite happy about. So yes, the MOT is due up. Now, I've got two choices. Do I sell my kidney, one of my kidneys, so I can afford to pay a garage to do the jobs on my car, or do I do them myself? I am quite fond of my kidneys and I'd like to keep them where they are. So I'm going to do the jobs myself. So in this video, what I'm going to do today is I'm going to change the back discs on my car, and I'm going to change the back brake pads because they're both worn down and need doing. So without further ado, let's get on with it. So all I'm doing here is taking off the back wheel. Pretty standard. I've got it jacked up, plus I've got an axle stand underneath as well. But also what I'm doing is putting the tyre under the sill just for extra protection. And there you can see the axle stand. And also chock the front wheels just as an extra precaution, because you don't want to end up like this guy where his jack has collapsed. And look, what a mess. I'm using a 14mm spanner here to undo the brake caliper retaining bolts, top and bottom. So go ahead and undo them. Then you get a large screwdriver and lever off the caliper. Just take your time because it is quite hard to get off. They had these crappy springs which you won't need on the other ones as there's no fitments for them. So the old pads will be stuck in there pretty good, so you have to leave them out with a screwdriver. The inner pad has a wear indicator attached to it, which will make an audible sound when it wears down, so make sure you got them on the right side when you fit them back on. You can now remove these metal clips, top and bottom, but keep them and I'll show you why later. If you're only changing the pads, then it's best to check the caliper sliding pins and re-grease if needed. Don't use copper grease whatever you do, and just make sure not to break the rubber boot when you're putting it back on. If you're only changing the brake pads, then you can just clean the caliper carrier while it's still on there. But obviously if you're changing the disc as well, you can do it when it's off. As we're changing the discs, you have to take the caliper carrier off. And it's got two 14mm bolts, which you need to remove both of them. It can be a bit stiff, so I'm using two spanners here to undo the bolts. The retaining screw for the disc was in there like a son of a bitch, so I had to use an impact screwdriver just to get it off. If you haven't got an impact screwdriver, then you could probably use a big screwdriver and hammer it and turn it at the same time. The old discs are normally corroded just slightly, so you may have to give them a little tickle with a hammer, little gentle persuasion just to get them off. Once you've got the disc off, make sure you give it a good clean with a wire brush and blow it nice and clean so you haven't got any debris left on it. Then you can use just a light smear of copper grease on it, and this stops it from rusting, so if you ever want to remove it again, it's much easier. The discs come with a sort of a thin film of oil over them, so you need to clean that off before you put them on. So I've used thinners here, but you can use a dedicated brake cleaner. And make sure you do both sides. So when you put it back on, just line up the holes with the retaining screw and the hole in the hub. And refit the retaining screw. You need to put the brake carrier clips back in, but the ones that came with the brakes didn't blinking fit, did they? So that's why I told you to keep the other ones, so I cleaned the old ones up and put them back in instead. The caliper retaining bolts don't use thread lock, but they do have spring washers fitted. And now you can slap the retaining bracket back on. You can now put the pads back in, but I recommend you just grease the back of them with a high temperature grease. Don't use copper grease. And this stops the brakes from screeching or squealing when you put them back on. Make sure the handbrake is off and wind back the caliper piston using a rewind tool. You can now put the caliper back on and tighten the bolts. It's best to use a second spanner to hold these sliding pins in place to tighten up the bolts, otherwise they just spin around. Just make sure the disc turns freely and that's it, you're pretty much done. Just put the wheel back on and you're away. Boom, job done.